Like many people, I have a problem with arguing with strangers on the internet. Instead of dealing with that problem healthily, I decided to make this video. Maybe I'll convince some of you. If you have a different viewpoint, maybe you'll convince me in the comments. But I decided to air out the discussion by laying out some facts to show what makes me have my opinion. Maybe you're a sword main like me, or maybe you're just tired of having to switch to the spear or the flamethrower whenever you see someone like me. Either way, I hope to hear some discussion and some ideas about how to improve the game that we all love and hate to play so much. So, the sword. It's had a lot of ups and downs over the years. As someone who's played since the beta, I've heard people say every season that the sword is a difficult weapon to master, and that's perhaps only beaten out by the dagger. I wanted to see how the sword has changed over the seasons. Maybe it's gotten easier, maybe it's gotten harder, but hopefully that will answer the question, is the sword the best it's ever been? I've got 5 main points about the sword to talk about, but first I wanted to shout out the person who made this website, the Finals Wiki, because it helped me immensely in making this video. So, the first point, swipe damage. I never could find a source for this, but I'm sure I remember the swipe attack dealing 70 damage originally. At some point, it became 74 damage. The switch to 88 damage was at the end of Season 7, and as of the making of this video, which is in Season 8 for me, it's still at this high watermark. If you're not a sword user, you might think that this sounds kind of like a small change, but it's actually a game changer. It made using the sword swipe attack one less swipe for all 3 classes, which is a huge change. So, for the first metric, it's easy to say that the swipe attack is the best it's ever been. It's only gone up. The second attack, the lunge, is complicated, so I'll get to it in a bit. But first, I want to talk about what I call hit chaining. Some people call it multi hit, I've heard other things too, but whatever you call it, this is my second point, and it's the ability to hit more than one player with a single attack. In the beta, once you hit an enemy with one of the attacks, whether swipe or lunge, it just turned the damage hitbox off so you couldn't hurt more than one person per attack. I believe this worked that way for every melee weapon, not just sword. However, that changed, which was a huge change when that happened. I couldn't find the source for which specific update did it for the sword. I did find a source saying it was implemented for the sledgehammer in Season 2, which sounds about right. As far as I know, since they made that switch, it hasn't been changed in any real way for the sword. So being able to do a multi-hit, that ability is still at its high watermark, especially for the swipe attack. We'll get to the lunge attack later. I haven't forgotten it. For my third point, I want to talk about utility, and what I mean by this is how useful the weapon is in everything other than damaging players. It's a complicated topic because every weapon has its little strengths and weaknesses and some intricacies, but for this video, just talking about the sword, there's 2 main things that the sword is currently great at, and the first thing I think of is destroying goo. It takes 3 hits with the swipe attack, which is about as long as it takes to throw down the goo, so it basically takes it down as fast as it goes up. Secondly, is completely unique to the sword, is the lunge attack. No, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details yet about it, but regarding utility, using the lunge to move makes the sword light the fastest player in the game, because using the lunge just to move around, again, when I'm talking about damage, using the lunge to move around moves faster than sprinting, and the light already sprints the fastest of the 3 classes. And you have unlimited uses, so it'll even outrun gadgets or specializations across all classes, even things like zip lines or bounce pads. And that is related to my third point, specializations and gadgets. Now, some of you may say, hey, the claim you're making about's the sword. We're talking about the sword. Gadgets and specializations aren't the sword. And I say to you, hey, everything in this game is connected. Having new gadgets added to the game really changed what it was like to use the sword because many of the weaknesses of the sword were improved drastically. The light has exactly the same specializations it had in Season 1, so no real change to specializations except of a bunch of bug fixes and some small balancing changes, which means the dash is better because of the bug fixes. Actually, all 3 of the specializations are the best they have been, but that's a small detail. But gadgets are a lot more interesting because the light has had a bunch of those added. The 2 I'm going to talk about are the thermal bore and the gateway. The thermal bore fixed one weakness of the sword, which was the inability to really do damage to structures. So if a cast shot was locked in a room, the sword main didn't really have any way to break down a wall. Or if a sniper was on a crane, there was no real gadget or way for a sword player to bring down the crane to get close to the sniper. Of course, you could use a red barrel, but everyone can do that. Adding the thermal bore really helped mitigate this weakness of the sword. It was introduced in Season 3. In Season 2, the gateway was added. Some may call it a portal. The gateway solves many of the same problems the thermal bore does, but since it solves it in a different way, there's still some situations where you might rather have a thermal bore or might rather have a gateway. But the gateway lets the sword user teleport a short distance, even vertically, and it can even let teammates in cache boxes teleport, or even enemies. So since these two gadgets are still around and they still solve the same distance problems, the gadget situation for the sword is still at its high water mark as well. Now, the fourth point, counters. If you played in Season 1, you know to hate the stun gun. Not only did it prevent sprinting, it also prevented using gadgets or even specializations. You were dead in the water. In the middle of Season 2, they nerfed this and let those that were stunned use their specializations and gadgets. And then at the beginning of Season 3, they buffed it back to letting someone stunned use gadgets, but not specializations. Therefore, for most of its existence, except during the second half of Season 2, it was pretty much a death sentence to a sword player. Mobility is the main way that a light class stays alive, and the sword is no different. In fact, since it's a melee weapon, your opponent can stun you out of sword range and shoot you in the face, and there's nothing you could do. There are plenty of other counters to the sword light, but the stun gun was the worst of them. There was just no way to avoid it. Then they did the right thing and removed it. Eventually, they brought it back as the nullifier, and instead of being one of the most hated gadgets as a sword user, it became one of my favorite ones. See, letting it still prevent gadget and specializations use was fine, since they also made those nullified invincible. Now, when the sword light is nullified, they can't die, they get some time to recharge their dash and other gadgets, and they can get right up next to an opponent without risk of damage. I actually love it when I get nullified because the person who did it can't get away from me. On the other hand, it's also way better for the sword player to use it than it used to be for the stun gun. When you use it, your opponent can't shoot you anymore. Sure, you can't hurt them either, but you can hurt their buddies. So, combined with hit chaining, the nullifier unlocked the ability for the sword player to go up against a team of 3 by nullifying one of them, so it actually becomes a 1v2 instead of a 1v3, and then they can kill those two players and then kill the third one when it's a 1v1. Reworking the stun gun into the nullifier slightly changed its use cases, but overall it became way easier to go up against as a sword main, and it became an even more useful tool for the sword player. Now, there are more counters than the stun gun, but I chose that one to talk about because it was the most influential change, and it's definitely still a high watermark when going up against stun guns or nullifiers today. There are a few more I will mention, such as the spear and the sledge. The sledge's damage was nerfed in Season 7 and is only medium difficulty to go up against as a sword player now. The spear is harder, but there are still ways of getting around it, especially since the nullifier rework. In a 1v1, the sword player could do a little bit of damage to the spear player, then nullify them to let the sword player heal, and when the nullifier wears off, the sword player can do more damage. That's just one example. There's other ways to overcome a spear player, and I won't lie, it is pretty hard to kill a spear player as a sword player if you're not experienced enough or you didn't bring the right gadgets. It's even worse if the spear player has some friends nearby. But it is possible, and there are more ways to do damage from a distance than the nullifier trick, like carryballs or grenades. So going up against a spear as a sword main is nowhere near as bad as it once was to go up against a stun gun back in the day. Again, I could talk about counters all day, but I want the video to be brief, so if there's interest, I could make that another video. In my opinion, counters to the sword may be the weakest they've ever been on average. And even if I'm wrong here, I think everyone can agree that the stun gun counter in seasons 1 through 5 was worse than any other counter of the sword during these last 3 seasons. Now, my last point, and the moment you've all been waiting for, the lunge. Now, this might be my most controversial opinion, so we're going to look into a lot more details on this. In Season 1, it did 140 damage. Now, it didn't have hit chaining, so that damage was limited to just one person at a time. So obviously, hit chaining is way better now than it was in Season 1, but we already discussed that. The lunge damage didn't change until Season 6 in Update 6.3.0, and it was a huge change. It went from 140 to 105, which meant it lost 25% of its damage. I'm not sure if there's ever been a more drastic damage nerf in the finals, percentage-wise anyway. This was the low watermark. Leading up to this nerf, many people had been vocal on Reddit and such about various bugs and exploits that existed with the sword, like the Phantom Lunge. In my opinion, removing the Phantom Lunge was actually a buff to the sword, but I digress. There were other problems that people were upset about, and I agreed with people that they needed to be changed. So, for about 4 months, the lunge attack was quite weak. Many people quit using the sword entirely. I didn't, and I could still have decent games with it regularly, but that was partly because people quit using weapons and gadgets that were sword counters since there were so few sword players left. The nerf came a few weeks after the stun gun was removed, so we didn't really have much time to celebrate. Put the stun gun issue with the lunge nerf, and you may begin to see why I make the claim in this video. From the beta until halfway through Season 7, the Sword Light either had to deal with the stun gun or the nerfed lunge attack, with the exception of about 3 weeks. And then, halfway through Season 7, the lunge rework was implemented, nearly to what it is now in Season 8. The damage was put in between the high and low watermarks, sitting at a respectable 125 damage, still down from 140, but way better than 105. However, a second change came in this update that really cut down on its usefulness. The Cone of Shame. That's what I call what they did to the turn radius limit. For those who haven't used the sword since 7.6.0, when you use the lunge, your character has their turn radius locked hard. That means it's currently significantly harder to hit chain with the lunge than it was before the 105 nerf. You can still do it, but you have to be a lot more careful now, and it's just not what it used to be. It got noticeably better when they changed the lock radius to mostly just being horizontally locked instead of locking both the vertical and the horizontal viewing, but it's still a noticeable difference if you started playing now versus, say, Season 3. However, it would be an unfair simplification to say that the lunge is worse now than it was in Season 3. Sure, you could hit chain better then, but there are other ways in which the lunge is the best it's ever been, and that comes down to mobility. I put this little chart together to show a bunch of characteristics. Green means it's the best it's ever been, red is the worst, and yellow is in between. This shows how, in a bunch of metrics, it's the best it's ever been, except for the clamping part. Damage-wise, which we already covered, it's in the middle right now. Overall, this means that the lunge attack is at its high water mark in some characteristics, but in a couple, it's kinda in the middle. This is probably the main thing I see sword players complain about. The lunge attack isn't what it used to be, but as someone who's been here from the beginning, while the lunge's damage output isn't quite as good overall as it once was, it's definitely better at mobility than it's ever been. On top of that, the damage for the swipe attack is the best it's ever been. The extra damage there more than makes up for the damage lost from the lunge in most cases. The only thing the sword was better at was engaging 5 people at the same time, which is such an edge case that it really doesn't bother me. Weapons shouldn't be able to do that as well as it did anyway. Don't get me wrong, it was a ton of fun back in the day to be in the thick of it with 3 enemy teams at once and in close quarters, but the swipe attack was practically useless from the beta all the way up until Season 7 Lunge rework update that drastically changed both attacks. When you factor in the vertical clamp buff that came a few updates later, these changes by Embark were genius. It improved the lunge in a bunch of ways, nerfed it in others, and also buffed the swipe in multiple ways so that both attacks actually became useful. It also gave the sword light the best agility of any light class weapon ever. Before that rework, the swipe attack was worse than the lunge attack in every way. You pretty much never used it unless you were completely new to the sword and just testing it out. One last note, if you're like me, you like a good summary. To make a visual summary, I organized 8 factors in a chart to quantify how useful the sword was at 4 points in time I'm calling checkpoints. For each of the 8 factors, I gave a 1 to 5 score, with 1 being a bad score and 5 being a good score. Then I averaged it all out with an overall usefulness score. I also used the rankings another way to visually summarize everything, everybody's favorite tier maker charts, one for every checkpoint. So, first, I made a Season 1 checkpoint. You see how lunge hit chaining, swipe hit chaining, counters, mechanics like hit registry, and bugs, all the worst they had ever been in Season 1. We have the lunge damage at number 5, though, and the gadget synergy is okay. The 2 gadgets I mentioned weren't portal and the thermal bore. Swipe damage was however, there are 2 of these. Or are there 3 of these? The next checkpoint in time was Season 4. The lunge hit chaining and swipe hit chaining were implemented, which obviously makes it a lot better. A lot of the hit registry bugs were improved by then. Utility was basically the same. The counters basically the same. Gadget synergy a little bit better because the portal and the thermal bore were added. The next checkpoint is Season 6. Gadget synergy's at a 5, not because any new gadgets were added between Season 4 and Season 6, but because the stun gun rework was implemented, which works extremely well with the sword. Finally, we have Season 8, which has no 1s or 2 scores at all. Lunge damage did go down a little, and so does the hit chaining with the viewing lock. However, even more bugs were fixed. The swipe damage and swipe hit chaining is the best it's ever been. Utility is the best it's ever been, with Lunge having the most range that it has ever had, and being very quick. The counters are their high water mark. So overall, when you take into account all of these factors, I did a math, and you can see how in Season 1, the sword was the worst it ever had been. Season 4 was way better. Season 6 took a dip, but still wasn't as bad as Season 1. And then in Season 8, overall, the sword is the best it's ever been when you look at factors that I looked at. By explaining everything with words and numbers, maybe I've convinced some naysayers on the internet. If not, well, I can't say I didn't try. Leave a note in your comments if it changed your mind. Or if I didn't and you think I'm full of it, you can comment there too. Who am I kidding? You were going to do that anyway.